Thank you very much. I begin perhaps by a disclaimer. My job is that of a journalist. I'm head of the European Commission representation here in the UK, so I'm expected to flit from bow to bow and subject to subject during my day. And earlier today I was speaking about the sovereign debt crisis and growth and how we deal with that. And they are not totally dissociated from talking about climate action. But I am hoping, though I'm not entirely convinced, that I'm at least one lesson ahead of the rest of the class here. If not, forgive me. What I'm going to try to do is attempt to explain where we think we are now on dealing with climate change and where we think we should be going. I fully recognize that it's probably not as far and as fast as where some of you here today would like us to be. But we live in a political world, and we are constrained by what is possible both among our 27 member states and what we can persuade our international partners to do. And we are inevitably dealing with a very, very complex matrix of differing interests, points of view. Those sound like weasel words, but the reality is that we are always working within the realm of the achievable or the possible. Now, the European Union has consistently tried to position itself globally as a leader at governmental level in addressing climate change. But there is always grumbling in the ranks, and you will have seen this quite recently in the discussions over the roadmap for 2050. I'll come back to that, but where essentially you have one particular member state, Poland, which is extremely concerned about the impact of measures to reduce CO2 emissions on its economic viability, given that its economy is very largely dependent on coal. And of course, that role of leadership didn't exactly help us very much when we talk about the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference. Now, what I'm going to try to do is two things. Is this going to work? Yes, yes. First of all, to look at where we are on the international level, and secondly, what we're doing at the level of the EU itself in terms of climate change policy, and finally, the conclusions. The international level, it's essentially what happened in Durban and what the next steps are. Domestically, how we move towards 2020, the immediate future, Kyoto 2 if you like, but beyond that, and perhaps even more important, how we move beyond 2020 through to 2050. And then perhaps try to draw a few conclusions. So, hold on. That's it, yeah. Okay, I mean, one immediately, when you're talking about international negotiations, gets into the alphabet soup of climate change. And, you know, I am not a specialist, so I was as sort of concerned by this, you know, LULUCF and CDMs, and there's more to come. Essentially, you know, what is the outcome of Durban? Firstly, Kyoto has not died. Now, Kyoto, for all its inadequacies, because it didn't cover enough people and so forth, was a first international start. And that does continue, and we will continue through this second commitment period up to 2020. And we have also tried to reinforce the rules on LULUCF, land use change and forestry. This is essentially how you can address some of the issues perhaps we were talking about when we were looking at soil usage, how you can use land use, forestry and so forth to contribute to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and of course also how you address the increased emissions which result from inappropriate land use. We also have an improvement on the Clean Development Mechanism, CDMs. Now that is one of those strange things where essentially if you're rich you can buy your emissions reduction from somebody who's poor. And we see this at a more personal level. If you want to do a carbon offset on your traveling, if you travel to a conference, then you can do this, and somebody somewhere will plant a tree somewhere where it will do some good, or that is at least the theory. They were put in essentially to allow the developed economies not to be too hard hit by a reduction in emissions. They have not been under Kyoto, under the first commitment period in Kyoto, as successful as they should have been. So the idea is to try to make them more real, in essence. Cancun, of course, was the son of Copenhagen. Now, Copenhagen was largely seen as a disaster, particularly from the EU side, because we felt sort of somewhat shut out. The whole thing was sort of hatched by Barack Obama and a few other odd people sitting in a closed room. But leaving aside any sort of personal unhappiness that individual EU member states or the EU as a whole might have felt, Copenhagen we managed to turn Copenhagen into something which was not a step backwards through the agreements in Cancun at the end of 2010. Essentially, we took the relative failure of 2010 and tried to move things forward. Now, I think there is a big question, which at least some political scientists are asking themselves, about whether in the 21st century the day of binding international legal agreements is actually is actually over, and whether we have to go more towards something which is a little bit more flexible. Now, Cancun is often held up as something which allows countries to make unilateral national commitments, pledges, which rather than to focus on the nitty-gritty of a binding international agreement, which may end up as slightly less effective than a rather more loose framework of national pledges. Now, that is not something I think that is the official Commission position. It is a position of some that one needs to focus more on the content and less on the legal nature of the agreement. The great era of binding international agreements was after the Second World War, Bretton Woods, the UN, and so forth. In substance, what did Cancun give? First of all, you did have a much broader acceptance by a much wider constituency than in Kyoto of the need to pledge reductions, and these were rather more formalized in Cancun, even if they remain political pledges. They're not legally binding, and the other problem is that we're still not they're still far high, they still lead to a far higher rise in temperature than the 2 degrees centigrade, which is believed to be safe. Cancun also agreed on a climate green fund to transfer money from the developed to the developing world, particularly aimed at the less developed countries, which will be the first hit. Formal backing for the UN deforestation scheme, and some work on technology transfer and inspection of emissions cuts. New market mechanisms, the Green Climate Fund. Subsequently, and what Durban did was to try to make what was agreed in Cancun operational. It also set out something called the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, which is a return to the idea of trying to, of maintaining the goal of a new legally binding agreement by 2015, applicable to all countries. And that is the big challenge which we're facing at the moment, apart from apart from moving forward on implementing the other agreements. And there we do run into the problem of the United States. It is interesting that China in particular is doing a huge amount to implement a green agenda. It's also building a huge number of coal-fired power stations, and one can't ignore that. But China is on board in a rather more substantial way than it was in the past. It's no longer pleading that, oh, we're a poor developing country. Durban has managed to move the process of involving the non-Kyoto countries along a bit. And the EU certainly played a much more significant role. And what are the next steps? Hold on. Yeah. Implementation of the Kyoto Protocol. I promised you more alphabet soup. For the second commitment period, defining the quantified emission limitation and reduction objectives, QUELROs. This is the average level of emissions that one of the Kyoto Annex B parties, in other words, the ones who actually have to do something post-Kyoto, could emit on an annual basis during a given commitment period. The carryover of assigned amount units, that's the carbon credits, this is the tradable carbon units, and also making the Cancun agreements operational. So monitoring progress on implementing pledges, and trying to expand the remit of pledges. There are, I think, something like 230 countries in the UN. About 100 of them still have no pledges. Not all of them are that important, but I've already mentioned the United States. And also, we need to ensure that there are sources of funding up to 2020. And negotiation, trying to establish how we get to this legally binding agreement in 2015. Is the negotiation process going to work? One of the challenges, and I speak as a former international trade negotiator, is that international negotiations are extraordinarily complex and complicated. We also need further short-term mitigation action at the rate we're going. I'll come to that in a moment. We're not doing very well. And one of the things that we are trying to do at EU level is to establish what is known as a high ambition alliance. Connie Hedegaard and her country person, but the Danish Environment Minister, had hosted an informal ministerial meeting of 30 countries in Brussels earlier this week, precisely to move the process forward in terms of these are 30 countries which do have high ambition, ambitions, which are focused on getting something out of the Durban, post-Durban negotiations, and looking at how we can actually maintain and build further momentum post-Durban. Because this is the challenge we face. As I said, post-Cancun, they reckoned that the pledges would lead to a 3.2 degree increase rather than a 2 degree increase. The green band is the path we need to follow to achieve an increase of less than 2 degrees. The baseline, if we keep on the current trend, is the yellow line, and that takes us up into the 3 to 4 or even 4 to 5 degree level. So that is clearly not acceptable. At the moment we have fragmented action which is taking us into the 3 to 4 area. Now one could argue that with the current economic crisis maybe the baseline scenario is slightly lower, but at best it would get us down to somewhere near the fragmented action line. So there's a hell of a lot of work to do to get us down somewhere towards the global action case, the green line. And we are. I'm not enough of an expert, but I think we're all aware of the difficulties if we stay somewhere around the yellow-purple lines. So much for the international level. It's clear that the EU on its own is not going to solve the climate change conundrum. What are we, however, doing locally? First of all, we will meet our Kyoto objectives for 2008 to 2012, and we already have legislation in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% as compared with the 1990 figures. We have just recently done a costing which suggests that in the right conditions we could go down to 30% by 2020. If you will remember, we had the 2020 target of 20% reduction and 20% energy saving by 2020. We could do 30% at a reasonable cost. Politically, that's a very hard sell in this country in terms of the economic implications, unless we can build enough momentum for others to move towards that. But because of the economic crisis, every cloud has a silver lining, we are able to do better. We can amend the emissions trading system. We have a decision which, if you like, translates the 20% reduction target into what has to be done by individual member states. Some are in a better position to do it than others for various reasons. I mean, Poland, realistically, cannot move as fast simply because it has an energy system which, in the short term, is extremely difficult to reduce. Binding national targets also on use of renewables, again around the 20% target overall for reduction for use of renewables. And of course the 2050 objective, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by between 80 and 95% as compared with 1990 by 2050. But that is something which will be difficult to deliver unless we can also get a global action to do this, because we will be creating problems for ourselves otherwise. Now the roadmap to 2050 is a very significant issue. It is part of what we call, the European Union has this wonderful ability to produce policy proposals, and we produced a fleet of policy proposals at the end of 2010 with 7 flagships. Nobody actually pointed out that most fleets only have 1 flagship, but we have, among our 7 flagship proposals, we have the resource efficiency flagship. In essence, underlining the reality that greater energy efficiency, greater efficiency of use of resources is not only in the interests of climate change, but also in the interests of being more economically competitive in a world where we see energy costs increasing. So, I mean, there is a positive convergence of pressures, and I mean, this is one of the fundamental messages of Nick Stern's paper, of course, that there's a positive convergence between economic interests and climate change, and that very much focuses on more efficient and effective use of lower emission energy sources, a low carbon strategy, and ultimately, without a clear roadmap up to 2050, then you're not going to get industry investing satisfactorily in order to deliver the lower carbon economy which we need. Similarly, it's hopeless, it is absolutely pointless to fix yourself an overall target unless you indicate how you're going to get there. So intermediate milestones, 2030, 2040, are also vital, because otherwise the temptation will come for any government, and the EU as a collection of governments is arguably even worse, to put off the action in order to and say, oh yes, we'll deliver it on time in 2050. Plus, of course, the other thing is that if you diverge too far off your off the line I showed you before, then you're never going to recover that carbon. And finally, and this also chimes with the idea of monitoring at global level, also the need to have a regular review on developments. And you know, one of the encouraging things, perhaps from our point of view, is that although the UK seems to have a visceral reluctance to set targets for anything, it is at least happy to have targets on climate change and in the various areas. In March last year, we set out the ideas for a low carbon roadmap with the pathway and milestones to reduce domestic energy consumption, domestic carbon emissions by 80% by 2050. And the challenge is also to have the same sort of roadmaps for transport and energy. That is what we're actually looking at in terms of achieving the goal we set ourselves of an 80% reduction by 2050. Within the EU, it is feasible with currently available technologies, with behavioural change only induced through carbon prices, if all the economic sectors contribute. But as you can see, do we have a laser on this? I'm not sure we do. Yeah, we do. We do?
Green button at the top.
All right, okay. Oh, yeah. As you can see, current policy, which is good, I mean, we're not doing everything wrong, but if you look at what is happening, current policy will take us to a 60% reduction, so we have the gap of 20%. Our requirement to do this means that we have to effectively reduce to zero the carbon emissions of the power sector. We have to reduce very substantially by a factor of 8 to 10 emissions in residential and tertiary sectors. Industry has to cut very sharply. Transport hugely, and non-CO2 agriculture and other sectors reduced by about half. Now, I can speak from my own personal experience in the transport sector. That is a huge technological and behavioral challenge. It's a technological challenge in terms of finding new sources of motive power, because we have not yet come up with anything that is remotely as efficient as petrol or diesel for driving personal transportation. We are moving towards it with hybrids, possibly with hydrogen, with electric cars. They are possible, they don't provide all the flexibility, so you've got a behavioral challenge. We are still, Margaret Thatcher said, yes, liberty means having your own car. That is still, that is perhaps less true now in popular perceptions, but typically every developing country, one of the first signs of liberalization, we saw it in the 1990s in Central and Eastern Europe, the huge growth of passenger vehicle transport. We, above all in aviation, which is growing very sharply, we have not, there is no obvious alternative to kerosene as a motive, as a source of motive power, which is in any way feasible. So it is a very large challenge. It is technologically possible, but it will almost inevitably lead to substantial increases in energy costs, one way or the other, through taxation. There are arguments about whether oil is at a peak, and the energy climate is changing. We're seeing a lot more gas available globally because of the use of shale gas. I mean, I won't go into the environmental impacts of shale gas, but that has totally revolutionized the global gas market. So it's a challenge. What it means is that we need a 25% reduction by 2020, 40% in 2030, and 60% in 2040. Sorry, too many. What are the benefits? Clearly, if we can decouple GDP growth and greenhouse gas emissions, then they are potentially huge, because inherent in such a decoupling is, first of all, huge energy savings and reduction of energy import. 30% saving in primary energy, which reduces our import bill absolutely hugely. So, again, we're into some of the arguments which Nick Stern was making, that the long-term economic benefits, and we're not dealing exclusively with economic disbenefits. Secondly, we have reduced pollution and health costs. Always difficult to calculate, but I'm sure Robin and some of your colleagues have good answers on that one. And of course, the funding which is released through reduced energy costs and fuel costs allows you to invest more. And this is vital, because we do need to invest a lot to achieve this. And we also and that will also allow us to innovate, because more widely than just in the climate change sector and in the energy use sector, the survival and growth of the European economy and of our way of life does depend on us innovating and being competitive globally. Net job creation, reduced economic risks from climate impact and oil shocks, those have been well demonstrated, but particularly the reduced economic risk from oil shock is something which, on what is currently a very, we're very dependent on energy imports, is something which is extremely positive. So what are the next steps? Sorry. First of all, we need to establish an effective monitoring mechanism. timely and accurate monitoring of progress in implementation. Without that, and that needs to be transparent, and I don't know whether it needs to so much to have teeth, but it does need to be very public and very clear, so that people can actually look at what's happening and be able to to name and shame in a way. The emissions trading system certainly needs some updating. There are issues of how you use the auctioning revenue, benchmarking to avoid carbon leakage, and the issue of inclusion of aviation, a global challenge, a major international row. So far, all our member states, despite pressure from various lobby groups, have held firm on that. Will they continue to hold firm? I don't know. It is an issue where the argument is absolutely outrageous, essentially, but it's not confined to the climate change arena. If you don't want something for whatever reason, then you say, oh, well, we agree with it, but only so long as everybody does it. And you then put as many obstacles in your way as you can to prevent everybody agreeing, to prevent international agreement on everybody doing it, and then bitch when somebody goes ahead and does it. Beyond the emissions trading system, we also need to deal with them. So we have issues like emissions performance standards for cars and light duty vehicles for 2020. That is critical because the bulk of road vehicles in the EU are not trucks. Trucks are relatively well dealt with. They are also typically paying taxes for use of the infrastructure in a way which light vehicles are not. Common accounting for land, common systems of accounting for land use change and forestry. It's a global issue, and it's also an issue which we have to deal with here. A recast of the of some regulations and implementation of the Energy Efficiency Directive. You know, we have the targets. The energy efficiency side is the one where we are least effective in meeting our targets. We are, I think, at the moment at 8% reduction, improvement in energy efficiency compared with the target of 20% for 2020, and that is not good enough. It's the biggest shortfall in performance at EU level, and it's also, and in many ways, it's one of the most difficult, and we discussed this in Windsor, because of course it relies on individual change, behavioural change. Next steps, we shall be proposing mainstreaming climate change into the, we have proposed into our budgetary process, which is underway at the moment. Now, I won't go into all the details of this unless you really want me to. The EU budget is a problem, however small it is. It actually accounts for 2% of overall EU public expenditure by the in the EU member states as a whole. We're trying to push for a lot more money which is specifically climate related, and also mainstreaming the greening of the common agricultural policy and so forth. But there is a lot of opposition to this. The UK does not like the idea of making greening a requirement for even getting your basic CAP payment. We want to have a much more climate change focused program on development of the European transport infrastructure network and the energy infrastructure network. Will that happen? Will we get the money? I don't know. Development cooperation. Maritime transport, how you deal with what is a heavily polluting industry, although at the same time a relatively environmentally efficient sector if you're going to transport goods over long distances. And finally, how to deal with climate change adaptation, which is a key issue and has been somewhat neglected. Next steps towards 2030. we have to look long term here. Yeah. The energy roadmap, define the 2030 policy framework. Energy investment is very long term, and we need to get agreement on the low carbon roadmap up to 2050, and we still have one member state which is extremely reluctant to buy into that. And so, the conclusions. At the UN global level, the credibility of the whole process depends on, firstly, whether we can implement Cancun pledges, and secondly, how we close the ambition gap between the 3.2 degrees which comes out of Cancun and the 2 degrees which we still need to do if we're to avoid major damage. The success of negotiations under the Durban platform, whether we can actually design a legally binding agreement that everybody buys into. Ultimately, you can railroad something through, but if you have too many reluctant participants, then you may have formal buy-in, lip service, and non-implementation. We can't afford that. Finally, domestically, the EU will push ahead. We feel we have no option. It's not so much a case of leadership, but economically we need to do this. So we will move ahead, but it will not be the sort of nice process where everybody loves everybody else. It will be rough, tough, as always. And it brings me to the end. If you want to know more about what we're doing, that is the website that you can consult. Thank you very much. Okay. Oh, right.
Sorry, we've done parts of the off, so we're quite time. I used to think the EU was a great institution because when I was involved with the lead campaign and getting catalysts on cars, as soon as we persuaded the UK government, it suddenly went Europe-wide. And I thought, what a great system. You only have to change the mind of one government and you're there. And I assume that was because the British government were the last ones to agree. And I thought the UN was a great system too, because with the ozone campaign, once the UK had signed up to the Montreal Protocol, everybody in the world seemed to agree it was a good idea. So I thought, what a wonderful system. But now it seems to be actually hampering the process that advances in climate change, because you've got 27 member states, one of which is heavily dependent on coal and is desperate to exploit its shale gas reserves, which I think Poland's got 50% of the shale gas in the European continent. And then as far as the UN's concerned, you've got to have the agreement of 194 nation states. Well, that's doomed to failure. That's never ever going to happen. So do you think that these great big international agreements you're trying to forge are actually counterproductive?
Well, okay, I will take my official hat off in that. I mean, if I look at the EU, I think it does have a positive effect. It's always easier to do things on your own, but you can carry more influence if there are more of you. But I think it comes back to the point I raised as to whether the efficient way of moving forward is through binding international agreements. Kyoto.
Kyoto hasn't worked. I mean, since Kyoto, emissions have gone up 49%.
Well, you don't let me finish, Robert. Kyoto has worked essentially for those who were part of it, but Kyoto did not have the coverage. And that is why Kyoto was, if you like, there was a disconnect between the Kyoto goals and the reality of the fact that the emissions growth was coming in countries which were not bound by it. But if you like, it is the question as to whether you pursue the fight against climate change by by establishing legally binding agreements with all of the problems that getting the lawyers involved, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, means because they're legally binding, they are pretty difficult to negotiate, or whether you go for something which is softer, if you like, which is focused on pledges. They are political, they are not legally binding, but whether you can, if you like, use peer pressure, for lack of a better description, to ensure that people implement those pledges. There are those who reckon that's the way forward. I'm torn. I spent a lot of my time as an international trade negotiator, so I am in favour, in principle, of legally binding agreements. Certainly the EU position is in favour of a legally binding agreement. It's also a reality that in its own interests, you have a country which so far has not been ready to sign up to a legally binding agreement, like China, a huge new emitter, which is arguably doing quite a lot to mitigate, with all of the qualifications that one can put on that. It is also working quite hard on reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the same time as it's increasing them. The answer is I don't know. I think we have to try to get a legally binding agreement because it is arguably the best way forward. But if we have to have a fallback, we probably end up with a fallback. But you can't simply say it's never going to work. I mean, what's the alternative? Do you say, okay, it's never going to work, so we give up?
Is that you forge ahead, and the countries that are reluctant get left behind. I mean, they suddenly realise they're being left out.
Well,
I mean, Poland could be kicked out of the EU if they don't comply with environmental requirements. You're going to get rid of Greece because of the financial mess they make. Get rid of Poland because they're environmentally destructive.
Good luck.
But it's a way of accelerating the process, isn't it?
Well, wait and see the results we get. Yes, Poland will move. The challenge is to recognise the fact that Poland will almost certainly not move as fast as some of the other countries, because they can't, in real terms. Kicking Poland out will not solve the problem of emissions from Poland, and they're right on our doorstep.
They'll realise they're backward and they've got to do... you could, for example, ban shale gas production in the whole of Europe. Why don't you do that?
If you can generate a consensus in favour of that, go for it.
I want to ask you about the extension of cap and trade, which has been very successful in carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
I wanted you to, if you could guess which way was going to be more probabilistic in terms of an outcome now, extending the cap and trade way of operating to other gases, methane, nitrous oxide, or whether it's more likely that we're going to get an extension of carbon trading, cap and trade as a way of handling to other industries.
Certainly the present doctrine is to use cap and trade as the way to deal with carbon emissions. I was just caught sight, I haven't read it, of an article published today which suggested, which said that although cap and trade is a good market-based instrument, you would do better simply to have a carbon tax, because cap and trade generates certain inefficiencies. But the present doctrine is that cap and trade, in terms of carbon emissions, is the way to do it rather than any other way. And so it's a case of extending it. There are areas where, and I mean, you saw from that graph I showed on the roadmap, if I head back on that one, we are not particularly optimistic for a really substantial reduction in in non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. You look unconvinced, but
I think that if it's true in either way, it seems to me that the extension by sector
yeah.
will have more of an impact.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
in particular, taking account of the talk we heard previously on the agricultural sector, that seemed to me to be, and the fact that the EU is so deeply involved in agricultural
Yeah.
policy, it seemed to me that that was a natural area for the EU to next look at to impact climate change in terms of outcomes in relation to greenhouse gases.
Yeah. We are trying to do this, but we are also up, we come back to the point I made at the beginning, of the balance between what we would like to achieve and what is achievable. And you will see this writ large in the discussion on how we spend the money we're spending between 2014 and 2020, where we are proposing two things in agriculture. One is a real, essentially a nominal freeze on expenditure on agriculture, so a real reduction in expenditure on agriculture, and a much greater focus on linking that expenditure, or at least a substantial part of that expenditure. 20% of the fixed payments to farmers would be conditional on them meeting certain minimum environmental standards. That is being opposed root and branch by the UK, as indeed is also capping of payments to single farmers at a reasonably high level, but it would hit certain extremely rich farming companies and individuals in this country, and I wouldn't name them because of risk of lèse-majesté, but those are issues where the UK approach is to say, no, we would prefer the environmental measures to be voluntary. I mean, the theoretical case is not totally black and white. I wouldn't want to knock the UK's case. Are we, in a sense, reducing the overall impact of environmentally friendly farming measures by doing this? To which the answer is, arguably in the UK, we might be, because it's a minimum standard which is easy for UK farmers to do it, but we are dealing with farmers right across the EU, and there are a whole lot of farms where environmentally, across the European Union as a whole, they behave appallingly, and we would like to give them an incentive to behave rather better.
I think it's